Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Subcontinent. The programme aims to discuss the most significant issues in the subcontinent that affect the governments, communities, organisations and the region as a whole. And as usual, we will explore and explain its geopolitics, untangle the arguments from different perspectives and make the alternative voices heard.
In this edition of the Subcontinent, we are going to take a look at America's Afghanistan debacle 20 years after the cataclysmic events of 9/11 that found expression in the so-called global war on terror. And we shall discuss why the US military-industrial complex decided to invade Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks and what actually was on the agenda.
The military invasion of Afghanistan 20 years ago kick-started with the Pentagon carpet bombing the landlocked country with B-52 heavy bombers and gunships. The disastrously misjudged response to the 9/11 attacks turned out to be nasty, brutish and long. The so-called war on terror only bred more terrorism as successive regimes in Washington sought to conceal the truth. The futile military adventure that consumed millions of innocent lives finally ended with the way it started. Suicide bombings and drone strikes in the heart of Kabul.
Less than a month after 4 hijacked American planes crashed into landmark buildings in New York and Washington on September 11, 2001, killing 2,977 people, including 2,606 people at the Twin Towers and 125 at the Pentagon, then US President led an invasion of Afghanistan, backed by an international coalition.
And military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The stated objective was to hunt down the alleged mastermind, the former CIA ally and al-Qaeda founder Osama bin Laden, who was hosted by the Taliban. As the US sent long-range B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers, AC-130 Spectre gunships and MQ-9 Reaper drones to bomb the Tora Bora cave complex in eastern Afghanistan, where bin Laden was reported to be hiding, Barbara Lee was the only US congresswoman to vote against authorizing what was to turn into America's longest war in history.
September 11th changed the world. Our deepest fears now haunt us. Yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States.
Barbara was labeled a traitor by those who championed the 20-year military adventure that incurred an astronomically high cost, with innocent Afghan civilians bearing the brunt. The so-called war on terror over the years only spawned more terrorism, while failing to achieve any of its stated objectives. 20 years down the line, the Taliban are back in power. Al-Qaeda still exists, while the Americans have been forced to pack up and leave.
It's way past time for Americans to question all of these interventions. Of course, our press goes absolutely apoplectic, crazy at the thought of some foreign government possibly trying to have some kind of interference in our elections. And here we are literally going around the world laying waste to one country after another. And I think the consequences of these interventions tell the whole story, truly. Over the course of the last 20 years, there are at least 1 million people dead, and I think that's far below the actual figure. Tens of millions of people have been displaced from their home. This has created all of these waves of refugees in these crises around the world. In addition, we have thousands of Americans dead, and we've again spent all of these trillions, and that's just the money that we know of. I think that number also is probably quite low, but estimates have been $6 trillion. So we've been literally hemorrhaging resources and focus and money to these conflicts that have been disastrous, one after another. And our own country is facing, many serious issues, including a horrific deficit and debt, and we need to stop this hemorrhaging.
The Americans launched the invasion of Afghanistan on October 7, 2001, on the pretext of decimating the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and to capture the 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden. That was the stated objective, but the real agenda was more sinister: to militarily occupy the strategically located mineral-rich South Asian country. While the American public initially supported the idea of military action against the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, the support waned as the futile war dragged on, metamorphosing into a worst U.S. foreign policy disaster.
On the fateful afternoon of October 7, 2001, as the US and allies started the 3-week deadly bombing campaign in Afghanistan, dubbed the Operation Enduring Freedom, then US President George Bush said the objective was to destroy Al-Qaeda, decimate the Taliban regime, and prevent the repeat of 9/11 attacks.
The Taliban regime is coming to an end.
The core objective was achieved in 3 months, but the Americans decided to continue the occupation. If eliminating Al-Qaeda and the Taliban or taking out Osama bin Laden were prime objectives of the military invasion, the US-led Allied troops would have called it quits long ago. But the aim was to occupy Afghanistan, strategically located between Central and South Asia. It was clear from the way the Bush administration snubbed Taliban's offer of truce to prevent bloodletting. Before the bombing campaign began, the group offered to hand over bin Laden to a third country for trial and even agreed to lay down arms and recognize the US-backed government in Kabul led by Hamid Karzai. The offers were spurned, leading to a misguided 20-year military adventure that ended in disaster.
This is in keeping with the policy of forever wars and never-ending wars. The purpose of the invasion of Afghanistan became, if it wasn't always the case, became a question of sustaining the various operations, the money-making operations that were going on there. So, we see the same thing in Syria. I believe ISIS would have been completely defeated years ago, was it not for the U.S. illegal occupying troops there. So you don't want to get rid of the justification that you're using for the occupation that you're involved with. And, this is how you keep wars going on for 20 years.
Even Americans woke up to the bitter reality years after rallying behind the war in Afghanistan. The worst US military and strategic debacle not only failed to achieve its objectives, but laid bare America's global hegemonic project.
The key objective of invading Afghanistan immediately after the 9/11 attacks, as emphasized by Bush and his hawkish Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, was to, quote, find, stop and defeat every terrorist group of global reach. The goal was practically unrealistic and unachievable. 20 years on, the threat of terrorism not only persists, but has assumed alarming proportions. Al-Qaeda is still around and thriving, while the Daesh militant group has mushroomed in Afghanistan under the shadow of US forces. That's how America's ominous presence breeds terrorism rather than annihilating it.
In the aftermath of 9/11 attacks, Americans vowed to crush every terrorist group of global reach, including Al-Qaeda. Bush famously declared on September 20, 2001, that the US war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda but does not end there. The impudence was clearly evident. Amidst the chaotic evacuation at Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport 2 weeks ago, a Daesh suicide bomber blew himself up, killing more than 200 people, including 13 US Marines. The ghastly incident underscored not only the vulnerability of ordinary Afghans, but also the US failure to eliminate the threat of terrorism in Afghanistan after a 20-year-long military campaign. It also blew the lid off US military-industrial complex's sinister interventionism in foreign lands. As reports later pointed out, the Kabul airport carnage also bore testimony to America's horrendous war crimes and impunity in Afghanistan. Many of those killed in the ensuing chaos at the airport didn't fall to the bombings but to the indiscriminate firefight by American troops. More civilians perished later in the US drone strikes. So as some would argue, 20 years after the doomed military mission began, Osama bin Laden has won the war posthumously. American presence in the war-ravaged country, often described as the graveyard of empires, not only failed to wipe out terrorism, but bred it.
Hundreds of thousands of deaths there, millions dislocated from their homes, an increase in radicalization and terrorism, horrific corruption, including making Afghanistan the #1 exporter of illicit drugs in the world. All of these things, we've so-called achieved there, and we've spent trillions of dollars doing it. So everything that's been achieved, in my opinion, has been quite negative to the point of, I would say, evil.
The war in Afghanistan, launched by George Bush in 2001, remained an enigma for his successors. After invading the country and destroying it beyond recognition, Bush launched another costly military adventure in neighboring Iraq in 2003. His successor, Barack Obama, refocused on Afghanistan, killing bin Laden 10 years after the 9/11 attacks. He began a drawdown but stopped short of a complete withdrawal. Years later, Donald Trump signed a withdrawal deal with the Taliban, and his successor, Joe Biden, finally pulled the plug on America's longest war.
The chronology of US military invasion of Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks sheds light on failed strategy and botched mission that plunged the war-ravaged country into chaos and turmoil. On September 11, 2001, a 19-member al-Qaeda squad flew 4 US airliners into the World Trade Center and Pentagon. A total of 2,977 people were killed. A week later, President Bush gave nod to military action. On October 7th, the bombing campaign began in Afghanistan under Operation Enduring Freedom. On April 17, 2002, after the Taliban regime was ousted, a transitional government was formed in Kabul. Between 2003 and 2008, Taliban regrouped even as the US troop presence surged. In December 2009, Barack Obama raised the strength of US forces to 100,000. On May 2, 2011, 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden was killed by US forces in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. A month later, Obama announced gradual withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. In 2014, the US NATO combat operations came to an end, although it never ended. The period between 2014 and 2019 was marked by uncertainty. On January 28, 2019, the US and Taliban agreed on a framework for US withdrawal. On February 29, 2020, the two sides reached a final deal. On January 15, 2021, US troops in Afghanistan dropped to 2,500. On August 6, 2021, Taliban launched an offensive, laying siege to Kabul a week later. On August 30, 2021, the last remaining US troops left Afghanistan.
Now, to have more insight, we are joined by Mr. John Kirvikow, journalist and former CIA counterterrorism officer. Before we begin, so glad to have you back on the program, Mr. Kirvikow. Sir, the failed mission in Afghanistan caps off 20 years of refusing to acknowledge the limits of American power. Could you say the response to the 9/11 attacks was poorly planned and incompletely executed?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think that the initial response, the initial U.S. Military response in Afghanistan was not poorly planned or incompletely executed. When you recall that the initial response was just to destroy Al-Qaeda. We went into Afghanistan in October of 2001, and by December of 2001, Al-Qaeda was destroyed. We should have declared victory at that point, and we should have come home. Instead, we didn't. We made a terrible miscalculation, a terrible mistake in December of 2001 to remain in Afghanistan and to try to build the country into some sort of Western-style democracy. The Afghans did not ask us to do that. The American people had no idea that that's what the government intended to do. And instead, what it did is it practically bankrupted us as a country. It resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, including thousands of Americans. And it was a terrible policy mistake.
Sir, do you think the whole misguided post-9/11 global war on terrorism, which found expression in futile military adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, was an emotional overreaction?
I actually do think that the response in Afghanistan and Iraq was an emotional miscalculation. And on the one hand, I can actually understand and I think explain why we miscalculated in Afghanistan. Iraq is a little worse, but in Afghanistan, you know, this was such a major national trauma for us. The 9/11 attacks saw the deaths of 3,000 Americans, and so upwards of 95% of Americans wanted to attack Afghanistan, to kill Osama bin Laden, and to make the Taliban pay for their support for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Iraq was a different story, though. Iraq was a deliberate effort by the neoconservatives who were in charge and power in the White House to just make war on a country whose politics we didn't like. When a country is invading another, when a country is occupying another, it doesn't matter who the head of that country is. Its citizens are going to protect themselves and their families and their property. And that was something that neoconservatives at the White House didn't understand. They didn't fully appreciate. And as a result, we were bogged down in two wars that nearly bankrupted us over the course of 20 years.
Now let's take a break from the questions and take a look at how the global media has covered the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in the backdrop of America's disastrous war and botched exit from Afghanistan.
What started as an operation to eradicate Al-Qaeda has ended 2 decades later with the return of its Afghan enablers to power. Rarely have so many lives and so much cash been spent on so little. It would be nice to think that US politics will learn from this debacle and both parties are complicit. But the story is far from over. America may have quit this forever war, but it will go on. There will be little time for post-mortems as we come to grips with the implications of a rebooted Taliban. In his long war against America, Osama bin Laden has won a sweeping, if posthumous, victory. The US reaction to the 9/11 attack he masterminded is like the cytokine storm that can occur when COVID-19 attacks us. The defensive measures our bodies mount go too far and damage the vital organs our antibodies were meant to protect. The 9/11 era began in Afghanistan, and now it has ended there in humiliating defeat.
Now, the American public initially rallied behind the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the support waned over time. Today, a vast majority of Americans have become critical of the US foreign policy. So what reasons would you attribute to it?
The issue is that literally nobody in the country thought that 20 years later we would still be involved in these countries. And so over time, the vast majority of Americans began to oppose both wars, both Afghanistan and Iraq, to the point where now there's been something of a sea change in American politics, where people are far more isolationists now. We saw that with Donald Trump's presidency. People don't want to be involved in these entanglements overseas. And another problem is that, you know, we've made a lot of people very rich with our military budgets over the last 20 years. We spend more on the military in the United States than the next 8 largest countries combined. If you're an American who's struggling to pay the electric bill or the gas bill, or to put food on the table, or to put your children through school. And finally, after 20 years, people had enough.
So up to now, we've seen Taliban's stunning takeover, US's hasty withdrawal, the collapse of the Afghan government, and the new Afghan refugee crisis. So could you tell us, what does this tell about the American military interventions?
Yeah, the collapse of the Afghan government points to an intelligence failure, an analytic failure. President Biden said that the Afghan government could survive for 6 months. In fact, it survived for 6 days. He didn't make up that date. He was given that date by the CIA. The CIA got it wrong again. And I think the bottom line is that that everything leading to the end of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan was a disaster. Now we have a hostile government in Kabul led by people who happen to be on the FBI's most wanted list, which is kind of funny and ironic. You've got a refugee crisis. You have American citizens who are stuck in Afghanistan and can't get out. What this tells us, I think, about American military interventions, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself, is that we never have a viable exit strategy. We don't know when the job is done, and we don't know when to declare victory and just go home. And we should have gone home 20 years ago.
On that note, I would like to thank Mr. Kyriakou for his precious time and insight. And as always, love to have you again on the program. Now, let's see how people have reacted on social media and cyberspace on 20 years since the 9/11 attacks and the Afghanistan debacle.
British journalist and broadcaster Piers Morgan says Biden's shameful Afghanistan disaster has made America look weak, spineless and cowardly 20 years after the 9/11 attacks. George Papadopoulos, an American author and former Trump advisor, notes that Afghanistan will be run by the same group that was uprooted after 9/11, calling it intentional by Biden to humiliate the U.S. military. Afghan-American community organizer Halima Wali slammed the U.S. for tearing apart Afghanistan and blaming it for 9/11 when Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan and the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Arjun Sethi, a US-based lawyer and activist, says nothing will change the fact that Americans should never have invaded Afghanistan, stayed so long, withdrawn recklessly, and indulged in worse human rights abuses. American political scientist David Rothkopf argues that the response to 9/11 attacks was hijacked by opportunists with personal agendas that were ideological or industry-driven.
And that was our episode about America's misguided response to the 9/11 attacks and its humiliating defeat in Afghanistan after the 20-year-long disastrous military adventure. To watch a melange of the best bits and pieces of our show and more Subcontinental updates, follow us on social media platforms and don't forget to give us your feedback. We shall meet again, same time, same day next week. So till then, take care.